Good evening, everyone. We'll be starting in about a minute or so. Good evening and welcome to the League of Women Voters Natural Resource Advocacy webinar. This is the first of 4 webinars that this year will make up our issues briefing. I'm Deborah Cronmiller, the Executive Director of the League of Women Voters, and I'm pleased you could join us this evening. Let me begin by thanking Ellen Penwell, our Membership and Events Manager, for the planning of this whole committee, and our efforts to bring you these 4 different webinars that will constitute this year's annual issues briefing. Typically, our issues briefing is a day-long event, but understanding that it's hard to sit on Zoom for 8 hours, we've decided to make this into 4 more manageable webinars, each focused on different areas of the League's advocacy agenda: natural resources, social policy, and government. We will conclude on Saturday morning with an informational session on how the pandemic has differently and more adversely impacted Black and Brown communities around the state and around the nation. I want also to thank and congratulate everyone who participated in this year's elections. For 100 years, the League has been informing voters and turning out the vote. We have tried and true methods for doing so. However, with the onset of the pandemic in March of 2020, we needed a new set of rules to play by. We successfully made the pivot from thinking about voting on election day to voting by mail, safely from home. Helping voters to vote, like the Dane County League has been doing for years through their Voting ID Coalition efforts, they've expanded these efforts statewide to ensure that voters that needed assistance getting an ID, getting a ballot, or finding a witness could be done with the League's help. Like so much that has changed for the League in this election, the biggest change was the impact we made. More voters than ever cast a ballot in the presidential election. More voters than ever used Vote 411 to learn about their candidates' positions, the location of their polling place, and the status of their ballot. Congratulations to all of us for participating in this important work and for making democracy work. Now, let me turn it over to tonight's moderator and longtime advocate for our environment, League member, Carol Terrell.
Thank you, Deborah. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. Natural resources is an important issue, and the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin has wants to enjoy your presence tonight. I am Carol Terrell. I am a volunteer member with the Dane County League. We have several compelling issues on water quality and public health to discuss, and a knowledgeable panel of speakers, all of whom are volunteers with local leagues around the state of Wisconsin. Please keep your microphone on mute and use the speaker view. We invite you to participate also. Please use the question and answer tab at the bottom of your screen to type your question. The moderator will read your question to the speaker. There are opportunities for you to join in natural resource issues with the League of Women Voters at the local, state, and regional levels. Please contact us of your interest. This program is being recorded and will be available on the League of Women Voters Wisconsin website under webinars. So let's get started. Our first issue is the fight to protect Wisconsin's North Woods and Lake Superior. Sherry Elgelson is a member of the Ashland-Bayfield County League. Sherry received her law degree at UW-Madison and had a long career with the Wisconsin Department of Justice Environmental Protection Unit, where she worked on air and water pollution, solid and hazardous waste management, shoreland and flood and wetland protection. I'll just put in a little plug. The Ashland-Bayfield League will receive the Good Citizen Award from the Wisconsin Sierra Club next week for their leadership and advocacy to protect the environment of Lake Superior and the North Woods region of Wisconsin. So here's Sherry and the Enbridge Pipeline.
Thanks, Carol. I'm going to start with a very brief background for anyone who's new to this issue. One of Enbridge Energy's oil pipelines runs through northern Wisconsin and Michigan's Upper Peninsula on its way to refineries in Sarnia, Ontario. When it was built in the 1950s, Enbridge got long-term leases from the Bad River Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa to run the line through their reservation and the Bad River watershed, a short distance from the south shore of Lake Superior, just east of Ashland. When the leases expired a few years ago, the tribe notified Enbridge that the leases would not be renewed and that they wanted the pipeline off the reservation. When it was not removed, the tribe sued Enbridge in federal court. That case is currently scheduled for trial next summer, though there are recently indications it may be postponed. In response to the lawsuit, Enbridge began preparing to construct a new section of pipeline south of the reservation, but still through the Bad River watershed, a location equally hazardous from an environmental perspective. Since the new location is upriver from the reservation in Lake Superior, the Kakagan sloughs, wild rice beds, etc., spills would still have disastrous consequences. In the meantime, the Attorney General of Michigan also filed suit against Enbridge, challenging the company's plan to rebuild Line 5 on and beneath the bed of Lake Michigan at the Straits of Mackinac, another horrible location for an oil pipeline. The Attorneys General of Wisconsin, Minnesota, and California filed an amicus brief in support of Michigan's legal claims, including the public trust doctrine and its effort to see the line decommissioned. The Bad River Band's and the Michigan AG's opposition to the pipeline came to the attention of the ABC League and others in northern Wisconsin, and after studying it and reviewing league positions on energy, water quality, air and land, and the Great Lakes ecosystem, as well as the record of spills and leaks from Enbridge pipelines elsewhere, we decided to take a position. And almost exactly a year ago, we adopted a resolution expressing our opposition to the new Line 5 and our support for the Bad River Band and other affected landowners. The resolution proposed that Line 5 be removed from the Bad River watershed and decommissioned entirely. After passing our resolution, the ABC League started working with other local and state organizations concerned about Line 5. The Sierra Club, 350 Madison, Greenfire, 80 Feet is Enough, the Superior Rivers Watershed Association, Honor the Earth, and the Red Cliff Band, among others. On February 1st, these organizations came together for a strategy meeting at Northland College in Ashland. An informal but deeply committed coalition was formed. It quickly became evident that Enbridge was attempting to purchase the land and/or easements it would need for its new pipeline. Some owners were willing to sell, others were not. Coalition members began tracking land transactions and organizing landowners. Faced with refusals from a number of key landowners, Enbridge sought authority from the Wisconsin PSC to exercise condemnation authority, which it can do if the commission determines that the pipeline would be, quote, in the public interest. Other interested parties can intervene in these PSC public interest determination proceedings, generally with legal representation. The attorneys at Midwest Environmental Advocates had been participating in our discussions, and it was agreed that they would represent the League and other organizations before the commission. Other interveners included affected landowners along the proposed route, Clean Wisconsin, and others. Enbridge promptly asked that the proceedings be stayed to give it time to attempt to negotiate voluntary agreements with the affected landowners, and the commission gave them until the end of July to do that. In the meantime, Enbridge also filed applications with Wisconsin DNR for permits to allow it to cross, dredge, and fill wetlands and waterways. DNR announced its intention to prepare an environmental impact statement and set a July 1st hearing date for input on the scope of the EIS. The ABC League's NR committee continued weekly meetings, and Chair Joan Elias led the drafting of comprehensive science-based comments, which were filed on behalf of the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin. Issues we addressed included the potential for adverse impacts on the many streams in the watershed, designated as outstanding or exceptional resource waters, the vulnerability of the watershed, full of flashy streams subject to washouts and increasingly frequent storm events, and the proximity of the pipeline to natural treasures like the Kakagan Sloughs, designated as a Ramsar wetland of international importance in 2012, Copper Falls State Park, just downstream from the pipeline, and the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore. A multitude of organizations and individuals testified via Zoom at the July 1st hearing, overwhelmingly in opposition to the pipeline, and DNR received some 1,600 written comments. Working groups set up by the coalition met regularly, as did what was called Midwest Environmental Advocates Client Group. League members, led by title searcher extraordinaire Bobby Rongstead, continued to monitor land transactions. At the end of July, Enbridge indicated that it had not secured all the easements it needed, but a week later it withdrew its application for a public interest determination, indicating that it had ultimately done so. Many of us are convinced that Enbridge would have lost the public interest battle, so it's unfortunate it was cut short. The League closed out our PSC representation agreement with Midwest Environmental Advocates, but it is understood that we and they will likely need to take up the fight again when DNR issues its draft EIS and wetlands and waterways permitting decisions. A DNR rep recently indicated when asked that they don't expect to issue the draft EIS until, quote, the early part of next year. Given the complexity of the environment which would be impacted by the pipeline, it might be a while. Enbridge also in late September applied for coverage under DNR's General Stormwater Management Permit for land disturbing activities. In this case, more than 915 acres. There is talk of filing with DNR a request to exercise its discretion, as the regulations allow, to require Enbridge to instead apply for an individual stormwater permit, given the size and complexity of the project. Going the individual permit route would, among other things, provide a public hearing and comment opportunities not available with general permits, and the League might want to join in that request. In the meantime, the Line 5 battle continues elsewhere. In June, a Michigan judge issued a temporary restraining order shutting down the line at the Straits of Mackinac after damage was found there. The injunction was lifted a few days later, after the Federal Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration failed to identify any problems. Michigan's Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy recently took comments on Enbridge's application for wetlands and waterways permits for the proposed strait crossing. Earlier this year, courts ruled against pipeline projects around the country, including the Dakota Access Pipeline, halted pending completion of an environmental impact statement, and the Keystone Pipeline, also halted for failure to consider environmental concerns. In April, the ABC League sent a letter opposing permits for Line 3 from Edmonton to Superior. With respect to next steps, in addition to the individual stormwater permit request already mentioned, the ABC League may file comments with the Army Corps of Engineers on Enbridge's application for permits to build a new pipeline tunnel under the Straits of Mackinac. As noted earlier, we will want to comment on DNR's draft EIS when it is issued. And at the risk of sounding unduly pessimistic, it is likely we will need to resort to litigation with respect to DNR's eventual decision on the wetland and waterway permits. We will again need legal representation and probably expert witnesses to do so. Midwest Environmental Advocates is watching and preparing with us. The battle is worthwhile and remains consistent with relevant league positions and priorities. The National League's Advocacy and Litigation Department issued its 2021 state and local priorities just last week, and they include, quote, opposition to the construction of new oil pipelines without the express consent of impacted communities. The natural resources at stake here are immensely valuable, as are the partnerships we have formed with Native and environmental groups. We are grateful for the statewide support we've received. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sherry. I encourage the audience to type your questions in the question and answer tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll be taking questions from the audience at the end of the program. Now let's turn to our second issue. This is water pollution by the forever chemical PFAS. The League has been very active on PFAS legislation and administrative rules under the leadership of Wally Brinkman. Wally is Professor Emerita at UW-Madison, where she has done research on issues of climate and water. Wally also serves on the state legislative committee. Here is Wally to discuss PFAS.
Thank you, Carol. Could I have the first slide, please? Okay. All right. Per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS for short, are a large group of artificially created chemicals that have a number of very useful properties and have therefore been used in many products that we, the consumers, just love. But we are just beginning to learn now that they're also very toxic. Could I have the next one? A brief history. PFAS was actually invented or discovered in the 1930s. But actually what happened was that someone threw together some chemicals and they reacted, and the result was a slippery substance that was almost thrown out. It took several years, it is until the 1940s, to realize the usefulness of this, and it was what we now call Teflon. Could I have, since then, the number of PFAS compounds and their uses have expanded over the years. So in the 1950s, we have PFOS, and then in the 1960s, P4, in the 70s, PFNA, in the 1980s, firefighting foam. The PFAS family now consists of about 10,000 compounds, of which over 4,000 are currently on the global market. Could I have the next one? So the useful properties of PFAS are that they repel oil and water and stain and soil, and they reduce friction, and they are heat resistant. Thank you. These properties make them highly useful in the production of common items such as food packaging, household items, stain-resistant things, non-stick cookware, outdoor gear, and even firefighting foam. But they're also used by many industries such as aerospace, semiconductors, medical, automotives, construction, electronics, and aviation. Could I have the next one? Unfortunately, PFAS also have properties that make them very, very dangerous. They are, for example, extremely persistent. That is, they do not easily break down, lasting forever, and hence are called forever chemicals. They're also very mobile, that is, they dissolve in water and are then carried by the water wherever the water goes, and that is into the soil, groundwater, surface water, lakes, etc. So because of this mobility and widespread use, PFAS are now present across the globe, and almost every person has some trace amount in his or her blood. PFAS also bioaccumulate in fish living in contaminated water, in animals and humans drinking contaminated water and eating contaminated food. For us humans, the major cause of exposure is contaminated drinking water. And as we're now beginning to learn, they're even at very small amounts, highly toxic. So PFAS, by the way, the concentration is measured in parts per trillion, or PPT. Could I have the next one? So the PFAS compounds have numerous serious health effects, liver, developmental, reproductive, and also cancer. What we know about the toxicity of PFAS is based on the study of research animals and is then translated into the outcomes for humans. Most of the studies have been done on P4 and PFAS, the oldest of the PFAS compounds. These two are, however, by the way, banned, at least in the United States. But because products containing those two were widely used and then disposed in some fashion, they are now a major contaminant of our environment. Could I have the next one? Major sources of PFAS are industry, landfills, wastewater treatment plants, firefighting foam. These tend to create PFAS hotspots, that is, area with very high concentrations. The map on the right-hand side showing some of the Wisconsin hotspots is, by the way, an interactive map available at Midwest Environmental Advocates. And what you can do is you can just click on one of these blue bubbles and out comes the detailed information about that particular location. In Wisconsin, DNR is currently monitoring about 40 PFAS hotspots, most of which are groundwater contamination caused by firefighting foam. So for example, in the Northeast, in the Marinette Pestico area, we have Johnson Control and Tyco producing and testing firefighting foam. And there's training in the use of firefighting foam at military installations such as Fort McCoy in Sparta to the west and at Truax National Guard Base in Madison. Could I have the next one? Now, the League of Women Voters is very concerned about access to clean water, about preserving the ecosystem, protecting public health and the environment, regulation of pollution sources. And the League has therefore, the League has therefore been very active in the regulation of PFAS in Wisconsin. Could I have the next one? Sorry. Unfortunately, we're just beginning to regulate PFAS. EPA established an advisory that is P4 and PFAS combined not to exceed 70 parts per trillion. The problem is that this is not enforceable. That is, an advisory is not enforceable. And we also now know that serious health effects occur at levels far below 70 parts per trillion. EPA is working on an enforcement standard, but that is a lengthy process and could take a minimum of at least another 6 years. So some of the states have taken things in their own hand and developed their own standards, mostly focusing on P4 and PFAS, although a few states are also regulating other PFAS compounds. Now in Wisconsin, regulation is initiated in two ways: review of standards and introduction of bills. So regarding review of standards, DNR periodically submits a list of substances called the cycle and cycle lists to the Department of Health Services, DHS, and requests that DHS review available toxicology information and recommends new or revised standards. For the current cycle, we're right now in cycle 10, the cycle 10 list included only P4 and PFAS. And DHS has recommended groundwater enforcement standards for P4 and PFAS combined not to exceed 20 parts per trillion. They are currently working on surface water enforcement. Cycle 10 is not yet finished, that it's not yet effective. After reviewing recommendations from DHS, DNR holds public hearings, then does an environmental impact analysis, holds more public hearings, and then the Natural Resource Board and the legislator approve it before it becomes effective. This process for cycle 10 is still going on, with industry calling the standards way too stringent, resulting in expenses to industry that would be passed on to consumers, while environmental groups, including the League of Women Voters, argue that the standards are still too weak compared to those of other states, and that the medical costs ultimately far outweigh the cost to industry. Hopefully the standards in cycle 10 will become effective in the summer of 2022. Now, the next step is to develop standards for PFAS compounds other than PFAS and P4. And there are currently two processes in the works. There is cycle 11. DHS was asked by DNR to look at 34 PFAS compounds to see if there's enough toxicology information. And just this past Friday, DHS came back with recommendations for 16. They didn't have enough information for the others. And there's also the triennial standards review. Every 3 years, DNR reviews Wisconsin surface water quality standards to determine needed revision as required by the Federal Clean Water Act. And that list, the triennial standard, not yet. Triennial standard list includes the word PFAS compounds other than PFAS and P4. DNR is right now soliciting public input regarding the ranking of items on that list. So given the current struggle with cycle 10, which only deals with PFAS and P4, cycle 11 and the triennial review are not going to be easy. Could I have the next one? So the second approach to regulation is introducing bills. A total of 7 bills regarding PFAS were introduced in the most recent legislature, the 2019-2020 legislature. The first 4 on the list that you're seeing up here deal with several aspects of PFAS in general. Then there's one that dealt with food packaging specifically. And then the last 2 on this list dealt specifically with firefighting foam containing PFAS. Unfortunately, only the last one actually passed and became 2019 Wisconsin Act 101. The league actually initially opposed this bill because we were still hoping for the passage of AB 321, which is the second one from the top, because that was a very comprehensive bill. But we then supported the other one because when it became clear that 321 was not going to pass. But passing a bill is not the end of the process. DNR then translates the language of the bill and creates a chapter 159 in this case, which describes in detail what can and cannot be done. Again, industry is fiercely opposing certain parts of it. A week ago, it passed the Natural Resources Board 5-2. The next step, or the next hurdle, I should say, is the Joint Committee for Review of Administrative Rules. The co-chairs of that committee already expressed opposition. So the fight goes on. We have already drafted a letter to that committee, and the plan is to call for league members to contact members of that committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Wally Brinkman. As you can tell, there's more work to be done by the league. We'll now turn to Ann Batista. Ann is the Vice President for Organization and co-chair of the Natural Resources Committee for the League of Women Voters of Milwaukee County. Ann is retired from the Milwaukee School of Engineering, where her specialty was research on science education for high school and college students. She directed a program called SUN, Students Understanding Energy. Here is Ann Batista to discuss lead poisoning.
Thank you so much for joining me tonight to talk about advocacy for lead issues in Milwaukee by the League of Women Voters of Milwaukee County. Tonight, I hope to show you what is possible when a local league's Natural Resources Committee has a consistent focus over years on a particular issue to establish a common knowledge base among stakeholders and then work with an already established coalition to affect policy change. Lead poisoning is a statewide issue, as shown by this data from 2016 from the Department of Health Services. Approximately 5% of children under 6 tested in 2016 were found to be lead poisoned around Wisconsin, at or above the CDC recommended threshold of 5 micrograms of lead per deciliter of blood. Lead poisoned children were found in every county in Wisconsin. The highest density of lead poisoning is indicated on this map by dark blue. Note that even within 2 counties that each have 10% lead poisoning among those tested, the numbers of children tested are dramatically different. In Sheboygan County, only 600 children were tested in 2016. In contrast, in Milwaukee County, 20,000 children were tested. Perhaps not surprisingly, 74% of those identified as lead poisoned in 2016 resided in Milwaukee County. I hope this raises some questions for discussion later. Other state data from the next slide, please, provides a clear picture of the location of the problem in the city of Milwaukee. In the highly impoverished north side of Milwaukee, with a majority African-American population of renters, up to 1 in 3 children tested were found lead poisoned. The national resources in Milwaukee. So first we asked, what do we know and what is unclear? To answer that, next slide, please. Our co-chair, Carol Diggelman, prepared a short 2-page white paper. Then we all started to read, we attended related events, and we shared resources. Finally, in 2018, we hosted a public forum on lead issues in Milwaukee. The public forum revealed the already well-publicized rift between activist folks on lead issues and the Milwaukee Health Department. But as you see in this next slide, please. When we asked what will advance the conversation, we came up with the idea of roundtable discussions. And this local NPR coverage of the second roundtable discussion shows leaders of those previously warring factions deep in conversation after the roundtable. I see from Eileen that I'm breaking up. I am going to stop my video so that perhaps my audio is better. Okay, so the features of roundtables that perhaps enhance the success included 30 or fewer participants, bringing together state and local policymakers, health organizations, and importantly, a variety of community and activist organizations. Other factors, perhaps a very focused agenda of questions about a specific topic. And those questions were addressed in small group discussions, and then responses were reported out to develop consensus burning questions that could guide later individual and group action. Reports from each of the roundtables are posted on our website. The outcomes were that a common knowledge base across all stakeholders reduced tensions and allowed for future conversation, and collective and individual actions followed. So next slide, please. The last question we asked within the Natural Resources Committee to guide our planning of events was, can we help to change lead policy? So next, we hosted a second public forum, this time focused on priorities for the north side of Milwaukee. And we did that this year, actually before COVID shut down in-person events. All along, we've been working as a member of a 20-organization activist group in Milwaukee called the Coalition on Lead Emergency, or COAL. As a member of COAL, we had met with health department officials and alderpersons to develop legislation and increase funding for lead issues in Milwaukee. We have testified at public budgeting board of COAL budget initiatives for Milwaukee. In 2019, COAL, with our support and that of its other member organizations, secured funding for the education of new mothers in the hospital and at home. And just last week, COAL was able, with our support and many other organizations, was able to push the local actionable level for assessment of the homes of poisoned children to 5 micrograms per deciliter. Previously, they had the resources to do this only for the most highly poisoned children, about 7% of those identified. Therefore, over 3 years, we hosted 2 roundtable discussions sandwiched between 2 public forums on lead issues, and then joined with a local coalition to effect policy change, perhaps a model for future action. Lesson learned about combating lead poisoning. I see I'm running out of time, so next slide, please. That slide will be available, and I want to just go to the very last slide then, and thank you very much for your attention. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ann Battiza. We'll now turn to Carol Diggleman to speak, who's going to be speaking on infrastructure. Carol Diggleman is a PhD professor emerita from the Milwaukee School of Engineering. She has a PhD in civil and environmental engineering from UW-Madison, and she has taught at MSO for 32 years across science and engineering undergraduate departments and in the environmental engineering master's program. Ann is developing an initiative on infrastructure. She is the co-chair of the League of Women Voters of Milwaukee County Natural Resources Committee. And we'd like to turn now to Carol Diggleman to discuss this infrastructure, economy, and environment initiative.
Next slide, please. Thank you for this opportunity to talk about an invitation that the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin has received from the American Society of Civil Engineers Wisconsin section regarding a joint project that we are at the very beginning of. Next slide, please. We did a series of meetings on infrastructure and economy. The first one was a general meeting on October 25th, 2014. And we had 2 speakers, a civil engineer and a professor in economics from UW-Milwaukee. And we took that around the state in 4 meetings in 2015. And I thought that was all there would be. And then on October 8th, I got an email from Carl Sutter, the civil engineer who was at the very beginning meeting. Since the last set of presentations was such a success, we were wondering if the League of Women Voters would be interested in conducting joint presentations like we did a few years ago. Next slide, please. So we started talking both, I started talking both with the League and with Carl. And there were great concerns that we did not include anything on the environment. And so I put another piece of this in Protect the Environment. And it seemed to me that given that we had done these meetings and not much had happened on infrastructure in terms of investing in infrastructure, and most all of these large projects require government funding in some way, that maybe we needed to address that as well. So we added improve our democracy. And then COVID came along, and we have yet another elephant in the room. So 2 organizations with different histories, different goals, are going to be working together in a bipartisan, collaborative way that includes students. And we want to pull together cutting edge technical, economic, and environmental information. We want to identify critical infrastructure needs, to defend infrastructure investment, and to answer the question, what future do we want to leave our grandchildren? Next slide, please. So, and this came from American Society of Civil Engineers. They have been working and now have an infrastructure report card for Wisconsin at 2021. And they are very serious about addressing advocacy for infrastructure, and have advocacy captains already assigned. I've received 4 of their bios. And now I'm appealing to the League of Women Voters to see if there is interest in supporting that from the League. We're looking at least to start in the 4 quadrants of Wisconsin: northwest, northeast, southeast, southwest. And these teams will be made up of the League, ASCE, students from the student chapters of American Society of Civil Engineers. And the teams will invite elected officials, construction companies, businesses, and citizens in their area. Everyone will be asked, what issues keep you awake at night? Elected officials will be asked, what can you support and still be reelected? And all of us will be asked, what are you willing to pay in taxes if you give till it hurts a little? Next slide, please. The plenary session will be the same 2 people who spoke originally: Carl Sutter, Senior Vice President of Environmental Infrastructure Division, McMahon Engineers and Architects and Engineers. He will give the presentation for ASCE on their infrastructure report card, which is a tool created to help residents, businesses, and policymakers understand the state of Wisconsin's infrastructure and to start the conversation about infrastructure investment. William Houlihan, Emeritus Professor, UWM, sent this statement: the situation is even more important than back then. And you can read that in the handout that I sent for distribution to everyone who is on tonight. Next slide, please. And after the plenary meeting, each team will organize follow-up meetings and students will be involved throughout to identify local infrastructure needs, to gather technical, economic, and environmental information, to assess technical, economic, and environmental impacts of these needs, and to develop an advocacy plan. And then finally report back to both organizations. This project needs to be sustained until elected officials are in place who support the investments that we say Wisconsin needs and are willing to pay for. Next slide, please. Current status. The project specifics, including the teams, timeline, a list of tasks are yet to be developed for this project. The project proposal was approved by the League of Women Voters Natural Resources Committee on October the 28th, a week or so ago. Due to the delays caused by the 2020 election, we are awaiting approvals from the boards of the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin and the League of Women Voters of Milwaukee County. Next slide, please. And this is an invitation. It is not fully approved by the League of Women Voters, but we are interested in getting a sense of how many women in the League of Women Voters from around Wisconsin would be interested in joining this project if it were fully approved. So I'm inviting you to send me your interest and where you're at and how I can get in touch with you. I thank you for listening.
Thank you, Carol Diggelman. That was very helpful. We'd like to turn now to our audience and have some questions and answers. And I see that there are 4 there, and I'll handle those right now. But there's time for a few more questions to be answered. So please use the question and answer button to put some more questions in. Mary Nugent asks, and this would be mainly for Ann Batista and also for Carol Diggelman. Is there a differentiation between lead poisoning from lead pipes and drinking water and lead paint in soils and in homes? Different solutions for different sources, but all may have implications for how to reduce lead levels. Ann?
Well, that's an interesting question. The lead is poisoning regardless of the source. There, of course, has been a lot of discussion about lead laterals and the cost effectiveness of removing lead laterals versus treating other sources of lead. In addition, Madison removed all of their lead laterals and found that they still had 50% of the lead still in their water because, in fact, fixtures in the home and lead soldering in the home contributes to lead in water. People will debate the relative percentages of sources. And so I don't want to speculate on that. I would say no matter where the lead comes from, it needs to be removed so that children are not poisoned. I do find that there are intermediate measures that one can take, and they're like getting a pitcher with filter and filtering your water, especially for nursing mothers, or not nursing mothers, but mothers who are creating formula. Water pitcher is really essential, or a filter on their tap if they know that their water is contaminated. Carol, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would say that when we look at your map and the concentrations of highly poisoned children are in very poor housing stock, poorly maintained. Children are picking it up all kinds of ways. Anytime, if it's in carpeting, it's on the floor, anytime they put something in their mouth. So where we're seeing the highest levels is really in these very poor neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Old houses,
Poorly maintained old
poorly
houses.
maintained.
Okay, let's switch to Sherry Eggleston. And here's a zinger of a question for you, Sherry. And you're muted, just so you know. Is there any safe route for an oil pipeline?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think there is, but there are some routes that are safer than others. And we think that the Bad River watershed, and for that matter, the Straits of Mackinac, are particularly unsafe routes. But the fact that there really isn't a safe route is part of the reason that we're advocating decommissioning and, in fact, moving away from fossil fuels and fossil fuel infrastructure. I mean, that, I think, in the long term is the real solution, is to get away from these very dangerous sources of energy and get to renewables.
Thank you, Sherry. Now here's a question for Wally Brinkman. What can be done when a municipal water supply is contaminated with PFAS and or PFOA?
Oh my. Municipal water. Well, I mean, first of all, you need to look at how at the concentration, and if it is serious, then you have the option of either using bottled water, or you can invest in some kind of a filter system, which is not very cheap. There are two generally that people look at. One of them is, I think it's called reverse osmosis, which, however, uses a lot of water, and it's most people, the better one is probably granular carbon, but that is on the order of several $1,000s. And so that is those are the options that you would have.
This was a very good question, because we're trying to, we're discussing how far we should go in pushing water utilities for protecting public health. The biggest push right now is that the League has co-signed with a number of other social justice, environmental, and clean water organizations to insist that the DNR require water utilities to test their drinking water. Thank you, Naomi Sky, for that question. I'd like to turn now to reading this. This is a question about the roundtables from Sue Nimi. How do we transfer these great ideas to engage local board of supervisors who are less impressed with evidence and science? We need to talk their language and impress on them how to make this happen, especially in rural communities. Actually, this would be appropriate for all of our speakers, because I know we work in urban and rural areas. But I was thinking that maybe we'd start with Anne.
Well, what we found with the roundtables is that people who never had the opportunity to sit across the table from each other were able to do so, and they commented on this. And we felt that it also kind of demystified what other parties were thinking. And so everybody was at least able to hear what everyone was focusing on. And I think what came through is that everyone was acting in goodwill. And so they saw the barriers that each group or person was experiencing, and it humanized the whole process. And I would suggest that if you have the opportunity to bring multiple stakeholders to the table, not just the supervisors, that might be one way to go.
Thank you, Anne. Sherry, did you have a comment? Because your league has been involved with quite a number of diverse stakeholders in the Northwoods area.
Well, I don't know that I had a particular comment, but we did have a really good experience a few years ago putting together, just as others have mentioned, some coalitions of not only government officials, but interested citizens and business representatives looking at the question of a major CAFO being sited up in Bayfield County. And that was, I think, really a stunningly successful effort. Everyone worked together very hard and very well and put together some very good regulations within the constraints imposed by the legislature, which didn't want us regulating CAFOs. So yeah, I agree with the others that if you can put together broad-based groups and get them working together, you can accomplish something.
Can I tell you about a meeting that Anne and I attended in Milwaukee a couple of weeks ago? It was a listening session at the Common Council where the Common Council members sat, and we watched them on Zoom. All the little rectangles were on the screen. And the chair of the Common Council was the moderator. The Common Council could not speak. So we watched while the Common Council members listened as over 100 citizens got up they had 2 minutes to tell what they wanted to see in the budget. So we were online for 3 hours, and it was a remarkable thing to watch because there were so many passionate people who cared. And one of the big things that came out was that people wanted the police to, I'm going to use the word defunded. That's not accurate. They wanted different programs supported. And tell what happened after that meeting with so many citizens expressing their opinions. And there were many who spoke on the lead issue.
Wonderful. We need to move on to another question. This is for you, Carol. Joe Ansel is asking, please define what you mean by infrastructure. That is, what is included? And another person has asked this question, what are the categories in the infrastructure report card? Naomi Sky.
Okay, I had a slide that disappeared from this presentation. So I don't know if it's in the copy that people have, but I've got my printed copy here. Aviation, and I'm reading off of the 2017 infrastructure. There you go. Aviation, D. Bridges, C+. Dams, D. Drinking water, D. Energy, D+. Hazardous waste, D+. Inland waterways, D. Levees, D. Parks and recreation, D+. Ports, C+. Rail, B. Roads, D. Schools, D+. Solid waste, C+. Transit, D-, and wastewater, D+. So it's this kind of a report card that you're going to see when you follow the links in my presentation and in the handout that was sent out. For the 2020 Wisconsin infrastructure grades.
Carol, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to stop you right there because we're actually at the end of our program time. Thank you. I know there were a couple more questions, some of which, like Sheila's question, that we really would like to hear. But I want to thank all of our speakers tonight. Sherry Eggleston from the League of Women Voters of Ashland Bayfield Counties, speaking on the Enbridge Pipeline. Wally Brinkman from the Dane County League, speaking on PFAS, the group of forever chemicals, and Batiza from the League of Women Voters of Milwaukee County on lead poisoning from lead drinking water pipes, and Carol Diggelman from the League of Women Voters of Milwaukee County on infrastructure. As you can tell, our natural resources positions are deeply connected with public health and a livable environment. We have strong positions on pollution prevention and the precautionary principle. And these positions allow us to look for solutions, which is in our activity and our advocacy. And now I'll quickly turn to Louise Petering, who is our president of the Wisconsin League of Women Voters, to wrap us up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carol. I have been very, very pleased with what I have heard tonight and all of the expertise that we have in our midst. It is truly a testament to the viability of this organization. One of the things that we need to do is to take a look at our league advocacy positions. You see here on the slide, the League of Women Voters of the United States, impact on issues. They're assembled are the positions that have been adopted by league members across the nation since our founding. They remain relevant because through time they have been reviewed and updated. Do take a look at them. They are available online. The website where they are available is shown here on this slide. We in the League of Women Voters, through our history of 100 years as well, have also developed positions. These are the grounding for our advocacy. And given that tonight's program was on natural resource issues, I can't help but say we have heard only about 3 different areas that we are concerned about in the League of Women Voters, all of which have to do with water and health and economic health as well. So I urge you all to take a look at least the natural resources positions and skim through them and find a niche in league. In doing that, we will be helping to grow our impact across the state. We currently are just shy of 3,000 members. And if 20% of our members respond to action alerts from the National League and the State League, we will have a tremendous impact. After all, 600 people contacting both their assembly representative and their state senator will probably jam their emails. So do see that you all have a role in league advocacy wherever you live. We can join forces with friends. I think collaborating with groups has been a very, very profitable experience, positive experience for all of us who have done that in our local leagues. Let's continue that and invite people to join our league efforts. We will shortly be providing an opportunity for all of our league members to notify the state league of their individual support for our action alerts. Next slide, please. We have been here for 100 years, and not only in using our advocacy positions do we support the future health of Wisconsin, we also would be honoring our forebears in the League of Women Voters who have spent countless hours over the years developing these positions. So let us continue to serve the people of the state of Wisconsin as league members and at the same time honor our forebears. Slide 3, please. Thank you very much for joining this evening's program. And we want to thank the organizers of this event, Membership and Events Manager Ellen Penwell, our Legislative Committee Chair Ingrid Roth, the Executive Director Deborah Cronmiller, the executive committee members, yours truly, Melanie Ramey, Beth English, and Treasurer Deborah Byers. And thank you very much to Maxwell Love for being our technological coordinator. Our natural resource positions basically promote an environment beneficial to life through the protection and wise management of natural resources in the public interest. And in doing so, we now have a diversity, equity, inclusivity focus in all of our natural resource efforts. So we close the meeting with a reminder that tomorrow night at 6:30, there will be another webinar. This one will focus on from exclusion to inclusion, building capacity, diversity, equity, and inclusion in the League of Women Voters. Thank you once more for joining us, and we look forward to tomorrow evening with you. Yes.